When siblings Jack and Emma set up a simple lemonade stand, they never expected the Homeowners Association to shut them down, claiming it was illegal without a permit. Led by the arrogant Larry Mert, the HOA's overreach felt like an attack on their childhood and their community's sense of fairness. But when Lisa and Mark uncovered Larry's corrupt business dealings, the tides quickly turned. The legal battle was just the beginning, and the payoff was a victory that changed the neighborhood forever. But listen closely, because the shocking twist that followed proved justice had finally found its way. It was a sunny afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Crestwood Hills. Jack and Emma, two bright-eyed siblings, had just set up their lemonade stand at the edge of their driveway. With a big cooler filled with ice-cold lemonade, a hand-painted sign, and their savings jar ready for change, they were thrilled to start their first summer venture. The air was warm, the streets were calm, and the only sound was the hum of the distant lawnmowers. Their little stand quickly attracted a few curious passers-by, and the kids exchanged shy smiles as their first customers. Neighbors who recognized them stopped to buy a cup of lemonade. The joy of earning their own money, even if it was just a few dollars, made them feel like they were part of something bigger. It wasn't about the money. It was about their very first taste of independence. But that bliss was short-lived. Mrs. Carson, a member of the HOA, came marching down the sidewalk, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. With a stern look on her face, she stopped in front of the stand, glancing down at their homemade sign with a raised eyebrow. "You need to shut this down," Mrs. Carson said, her voice sharp, with a hint of authority that no child could ignore. "You're running an illegal business. Without a permit, you can't sell anything here." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "But it's just lemonade," he protested, his voice trembling slightly. She crossed her arms, her lips pursed. "I don't care what it is. You need a permit to operate in this neighborhood. And, frankly, I don't appreciate this kind of thing being set up in front of my house." Emma's eyes widened in confusion. "But we're not hurting anyone," she whispered to Jack. At first, Jack thought it was a small issue, just one grumpy neighbor causing trouble. He didn't want to make a scene, so they gathered their things and moved the stand to a different spot on their lawn. But within minutes, other members of the HOA showed up. Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Carson's partner in enforcing neighborhood rules, and a few others who were quick to chime in. "Shut it down," Mr. Daniels barked. "This is a violation of HOA regulations. If you continue, you'll be fined. Don't think we won't take action." Jack and Emma stood frozen. The harsh words sank into them like a weight in their stomachs. The fun and excitement of the afternoon suddenly evaporated. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet here they were, facing the wrath of people who were supposed to be their neighbors, people they thought were there to support the community. Their hearts sank as they realized this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a full-blown confrontation. The weight of the threats, the looming fines, and the uncertainty of what would come next hit them hard. All they wanted was a chance to feel like they belonged, to earn their own money, but now they were left with nothing but frustration and confusion. The lemonade stand was abandoned, the cooler left to melt in the heat, the kids too stunned to say a word. The neighborhood, once filled with the sound of laughter and ice cubes clinking in cups, now felt distant, cold. This wasn't the summer they had imagined, and for the first time, Jack and Emma realized just how powerful the HOA could be, and just how quickly their innocent joy could be crushed under the weight of bureaucracy. When Jack and Emma walked back into their house, their faces a mixture of shock and defeat. Lisa and Mark immediately knew something was wrong. The kids barely had the time to explain before the anger bubbled to the surface. Lisa's voice trembled with frustration as she heard the story. "What do you mean they made you shut it down?" she asked, pacing back and forth in the living room, her hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous." Mark stood by the window, staring out into the front yard as if trying to convince himself that the whole thing was some kind of misunderstanding. But there was no mistaking the cold reality of what had happened. Their children, innocent, excited kids trying to make a few bucks, had been shut down by their own neighbors. Lisa could feel her blood pressure rise as she processed the unfairness. "They have no right to do this," Lisa said, her voice getting louder. "It's a lemonade stand. It's not like they're running a full-blown business here." Mark's jaw tightened. He couldn't stand the idea of anyone, let alone the HOA, bullying his kids over something so harmless. They had worked so hard for everything they had, and now this. But the real firestorm began when Larry Mert, the head of the HOA, showed up at their doorstep later that afternoon, his arms crossed and his face set in that familiar smug expression. Lisa and Mark had seen him around the neighborhood, always walking with an air of superiority, always making sure the lawns were trimmed just so, the flower beds pristine. He prided himself on maintaining order in the community, and by his standards, anything that didn't fit into his narrow idea of what was acceptable was fair game for regulation. "I understand there was some confusion," Larry began, his tone dripping with condescension, like he was talking to a child, "but this stand," he gestured to the now empty driveway, "isn't in line with our community standards. The kids need a permit for something like this. Rules are rules, Lisa." Mark's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Rules?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What harm has a lemonade stand done? It's a tradition. Kids all over the country do this. You're going to tell me that we have to follow some petty rule for a harmless stand?" Larry's lips curled into a smirk, the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who thought they were always in the right, no matter how wrong they were. "I'm simply doing my job. You know the HOA is responsible for ensuring order in this neighborhood, and frankly, this isn't acceptable. We've had complaints from other residents." Mark's fists clenched. "Complaints? From who? You're going to shut down kids trying to make a little money for no reason other than that it doesn't fit into your perfect little world." He could feel the heat rising in his chest. "This isn't about rules. It's about you wanting to control everything and everyone." Larry straightened up, his tone becoming more forceful. "Don't get emotional, Mark. I'm only trying to keep things in line here. If you want to challenge me on this, I suggest you take it up with the board." It was then that Lisa and Mark realized just how far Larry's arrogance went. This wasn't about enforcing the rules. It was about power, pure and simple. And it became clearer with every word Larry spoke. The HOA wasn't just a group of well-meaning homeowners trying to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was a self-appointed governing body that had found a way to assert control over every aspect of their lives. Lisa felt the boiling rage inside her. "And you know what else?" she said, her voice trembling with fury. "We know about your little business dealings, Larry. You've been buying up properties in this neighborhood, turning them into rentals for a profit. Is that why you're so intent on making sure no one steps out of line?" Larry's eyes flickered for a brief moment, just long enough for them to catch it. The truth was out. The people who ran the HOA, including Larry, weren't just enforcing rules. They were exploiting them. And this little permit issue wasn't about order. It was about making sure nothing threatened their profit-driven agenda. Mark took a step forward, his voice cold and steady. "You're abusing your power. You've been using this community for your own gain." Larry's expression hardened, and without another word, he turned and left, leaving behind an undeniable sense of injustice. As he walked away, Lisa felt a weight in her chest, a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The whole situation stank. Jack and Emma were just kids. All they wanted was to set up a simple lemonade stand, but Larry's greed and arrogance had turned their innocent joy into a battleground, and the more they thought about it, the angrier they became. They weren't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just about a lemonade stand. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could push everyone around for their own gain. And that's exactly what they intended to do. The moment the door slammed shut after Larry's departure, Lisa and Mark knew they couldn't just sit back and let him and the HOA steamroll them. The anger that had been simmering in the pit of their stomachs now bubbled over. They had to fight, and they weren't going to be intimidated. The more they thought about the injustice, the more their resolve hardened. "We're not letting him get away with this," Lisa said, pacing the living room. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming frustration of it all. She had spent years in this community, raising her kids and making sure they followed the rules, only for some arrogant HOA president to crush their spirits over a harmless lemonade stand. Mark, now in full agreement, picked up his phone and dialed a local lawyer who specialized in civil rights and neighborhood disputes. He needed someone who understood the stakes, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to the power-hungry HOA. The lawyer they reached out to, Jenna Taylor, was quick to respond. After a brief conversation, she agreed to take on their case. As Mark sat down to go over the legal details with Jenna, Lisa turned her attention to something else. The more they discussed the situation, the more she began to realize just how deep the corruption ran. Larry's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. But what Lisa didn't expect was the twist of fate that would reveal just how deeply tangled Larry was in his own web of lies. It started with a tip. A neighbor, Carl, had worked in real estate for years and had always suspected that something wasn't right about the way Larry had been acquiring properties in their neighborhood. Larry had been buying homes, flipping them, and renting them out at inflated prices, all under the guise of maintaining community standards. The more Carl spoke to Lisa and Mark, the clearer it became that Larry's business dealings weren't as transparent as he made them seem. Then came the bombshell. Lisa was at work when she received a call from Mark, his voice low with disbelief. "Lisa, you're not going to believe this, but the IRS is investigating Larry. It looks like they're auditing his business dealings." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "What? The IRS?" "Yeah. Apparently there's been some serious concern over his tax practices. They've been following his property deals, and from what I can gather, it's not looking good for him. They're digging deep into how he's been flipping houses and manipulating property taxes." Mark's voice was a mix of shock and vindication. Lisa felt a rush of satisfaction as the pieces started falling into place. The very man who had tried to shut down their kids' lemonade stand over some arbitrary rule was now facing the heat from the IRS for far more serious wrongdoing. It felt like the universe was lining up in their favor. "I knew something wasn't right with that guy," Lisa muttered, almost to herself. "He thought he could push everyone around, including our kids. And now he's got the IRS on his back." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The IRS investigation meant that Larry's financial activities were now in the spotlight, and with it, the HOA's shady dealings. The more Lisa and Mark dug into Larry's history, the clearer it became that his entire approach to the HOA, his overbearing, controlling attitude, wasn't just about rules or community standards. It was a smokescreen, a way to cover up his financial manipulations and questionable property investments. But the anger that had built up within Lisa and Mark wasn't just about Larry anymore. It was about everyone in the neighborhood who had been too scared or too passive to speak up against Larry and the HOA. It was about the other families who had been forced to toe the line for years, living in constant fear of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. As Jenna, their lawyer, began pulling together the legal groundwork to challenge the HOA's actions, Mark and Lisa started rallying neighbors. They reached out to other families, sharing what they had discovered about Larry and his business dealings. The truth was out, and it spread like wildfire. People who had previously been too afraid to speak up now felt empowered. "We've been living under this cloud for too long," one neighbor, David, told Mark during a meeting at his house. "It's time we finally stand up to Larry and this corrupt HOA. You're not the only ones he's been pushing around. We're with you." By the end of the week, Mark and Lisa had gathered enough signatures from neighbors to launch a full-scale protest against the HOA. They weren't just fighting for their kids' lemonade stand anymore. They were fighting for their community, for the principle that no one, especially not someone with so many hidden motives, could come in and trample over their rights without consequences. And as the pressure mounted on Larry, the sense of satisfaction grew. The rage they felt before now turned into a quiet determination. They weren't going to let Larry and the HOA win. They were going to make sure their kids could stand proud, that their voices were heard, and that the truth would not be buried under Larry's pile of shady deals. Larry had awakened a force greater than he could have ever imagined. The days following the IRS investigation were nothing short of explosive. News spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Larry's tangled web of corruption was finally unraveling, and the weight of his wrongdoings was bearing down on him harder than anyone could have anticipated. The IRS dug deeper, uncovering evidence of shady tax evasion, underhanded property deals, and a slew of violations that would soon have Larry facing serious legal consequences. For Lisa and Mark, it was the sweet taste of victory they'd been craving. They had known from the start that Larry wasn't just a stubborn HOA president, but a man hiding behind a facade of power to protect his self-serving interests. As the investigation grew in scope, his arrogance and disregard for the community's well-being came to light in ways that could no longer be ignored. The HOA, once united behind Larry's leadership, was quickly distancing itself from him. There was nowhere left to hide, and the association had no choice but to issue an apology to Jack and Emma. It was a small but significant moment, as the HOA's leadership acknowledged the harassment they'd imposed on two innocent children. The apology was delivered in a letter that read more like a public relations attempt than a heartfelt statement. But for Lisa and Mark, it was a victory nonetheless. "We didn't do this for the apology," Lisa said, holding the letter in her hands, a hard edge of satisfaction in her voice. "But it feels good to see them finally own up to what they did." Jack and Emma, who had watched their parents go to battle over the last few weeks, felt an incredible sense of pride. The injustice they had faced was no longer a distant memory. They had become part of something bigger, something that made their community take a hard look at itself. It was when the final blow landed that the real satisfaction hit. Larry was charged with multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. His business dealings, which he had so carefully kept under wraps, were exposed to the public. People who had once turned a blind eye to his manipulations now saw the full picture. Larry's empire was crumbling, and it was clear that his grip on the HOA and on the neighborhood was slipping away. For Jack and Emma, the victory wasn't just personal. It was for everyone who had been living under the thumb of an unjust system. The kids reopened their lemonade stand in front of their house on the weekend. This time, the stand was different. It wasn't just a little business venture. It was a symbol of resistance, of standing up against oppression and fighting for what was right. The whole neighborhood, now united and energized by the recent events, showed up to support the kids. It was no longer just Jack and Emma selling lemonade. It was their entire community rallying behind them, turning their humble stand into a powerful statement. Neighbors came with donations, smiles, and words of encouragement. Some stayed to help, while others just stopped by to show their support. It felt like a celebration of justice, of strength, and of the community's newfound sense of unity. Jack smiled at Emma as they handed out cups of lemonade, the pride of knowing they had fought for what was right filling their hearts. "I guess we really showed them, huh?" Jack said, handing a cup to Mr. Reynolds, a neighbor who had been skeptical of the protest, but had come around after seeing the truth. Emma nodded, her eyes sparkling. "Yeah, we did." Lisa and Mark stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. For them, it wasn't just about the legal victory or the apology. It was about the lesson their kids had learned. Standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but when you had the courage to do it, it could change everything. The feeling in the air was electric, like the storm had passed and the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. The neighborhood was different now. People who had once kept their heads down were speaking out, taking a stand against corruption and unfairness. The HOA's power had been diminished, and Larry's influence had been shattered. In the end, Jack and Emma's lemonade stand had become a symbol of more than just childhood innocence. It had become a reminder that standing up to injustice, no matter how small it seemed at first, could make a difference. It wasn't just about lemonade. It was about community, about strength, and about the power of doing the right thing. And as they closed up the stand that afternoon, with the sun setting over the peaceful neighborhood, it felt like everything had come full circle. The fight wasn't just one for Jack and Emma, it was one for everyone. It was a victory that proved, in the end, standing up for what's right could turn the tide against injustice.